The Sunday of the RFK Journalism Award luncheon, Ruth drove out to Hickory Hill early to make sure that everything was in order. As she calmly walked up to the house, she thought, well, I survived. We're here. It'll go off. But her brief reverie was rudely interrupted by Ethel yelling at the top of her lungs from the tennis court. Ruth! Where are all the chairs? What chairs? A mystified Ruth asked. The chairs for the people who are coming to the reception so they can sit, the exasperated Ethel explained slowly as if talking to a child. Other than a few chairs set aside for elderly guests, Ruth told her that she had not been instructed to order extra chairs. Ethel muttered to herself and stormed off. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise, and today we're going to be reading from The Other Mrs. Kennedy. And today we're talking about Ethel's treatment of her staff, and it is quite bleak, to put it charitably. There's a lot of allegations swirling around Ethel and the way she treated people, but today we're going to hear many first-hand accounts of what people experienced and witnessed with Ethel, including her slinging the N-word. But while that has been disputed by some people say, oh, she would never do that. Some people say, oh, I heard her say that. What cannot be disputed is the fact that she would frequently physically assault her staff. And to me, a person who's going to physically assault her staff is a person who would think nothing of using the N-word if she felt that it suited the occasion. And I think that if a person's going to hit you with their hand, then slinging some hateful, evil words at you wouldn't even make them skip a beat. What's saying something mean to you if they are willing to hit you too? And I think that somebody who's going to get physically aggressive is somebody who is also going to get verbally aggressive. So I'll let you quibble over whether you think she said the N-word or not, but there's no quibbling over the amount of people who are going to come forward in this and the next chapter to discuss the way that Ethel horrifically treated the people in her sphere and the people who worked for her. The tales are shocking. So the first chapter we're going to read is entitled Anger and Fury, and that is obviously about the way that Ethel is treating her staff. She had an enormous reservoir of wrath and rage and indignation that her life had turned out the way that it had. And then the next chapter that we're going to read is called Stomach Pains, and that refers to the physical ailments that her staff were experiencing because of the stress, the strain, the fear that they felt working for her. One woman ends up having a heart attack. So it's bleak. The staff even went so far as to nickname Hickory Hill Hickory Hell because it was so stressful working there. Let's get into it. Chapter 101, Anger and Fury, begins this way. Ruth Dromstatter, executive director of the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Awards program, had for the most part successfully avoided contact with Ethel. A professional writer and researcher, Ruth had heard from colleagues how abrasive, sharp-tongued, and tyrannical Ethel could be, but had never had first-hand experience. Luckily, there had always been a buffer between her and the widow, most notably longtime family soldier Dave Hackett, executive director of the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial, the umbrella organization for the Journalism Award and related programs. Hackett often boasted to his employees, "Don't worry, I can handle her." We shall see. But as time neared for the latest annual award ceremony, Hackett developed serious stomach problems and had to be hospitalized. Others charged with keeping Ethel at bay managed to find their own excuses to distance themselves from her, leaving Ruth directly in the line of fire. One late spring afternoon, the telephone rang at the Memorial Townhouse offices in Georgetown. It was Ethel calling. Ruth, she said, needed to drop whatever she was doing and come to help her at once. She had to make a quick decision on which tablecloth should be used at the forthcoming awards luncheon. She instructed the executive director to pick up a sample on hold at Lord & Taylor's in Chevy Chase and deliver it to Hickory Hill forthwith. "I've got another tablecloth here at the house," Ethel said, "and I'm trying to compare the two to see which one is best. I want you to help me choose." Hearing Ethel's strident tone, Ruth's intuition told her that her days were numbered. "We were on a deadline. I was under pressure, but I didn't feel that I could say no to her," she said later. It was one of those where does a 2,000-pound elephant sit situations. With trepidation, she picked up the tablecloth and drove out to Hickory Hill, her only visit there in the almost 3 years that she'd worked for the program. She was greeted by a bubbly young secretary, Susie Wells, who worshipped Ethel and called her Ma. "Come on up," Wells said, pointing to the stairs. "Mrs. Kennedy's in her bedroom." After a quick introduction, Ethel held up the 2 tablecloths. "Well?" she said impatiently, tapping her foot. Ruth didn't know what to say as she looked from one to the other. The 2 tablecloths were exactly the same. Exactly, she emphasized years later. Absolutely. No question about it, they were the same tablecloth. Panic-stricken, she looked from one to the other, and finally she turned to Susie Wells in mute appeal. After a long pause, Wells rescued her. "Well, Mrs. Kennedy, I sort of like the left one." She nodded meaningfully at Ruth, who babbled her agreement. "Oh, yes, Mrs. Kennedy, definitely the tablecloth on the left." Ethel looked pleased and ushered the 2 women to her bedroom door. "Good," she said. "That was my choice, too. Susie, have Lord and Taylor pick up the other tablecloth. Ruth, thank you for coming. Goodbye." She was called from Georgetown out to Hickory Hill to deliver a tablecloth that was exactly the same as the other one, and then was told to pick which one was going to be better, and then just sort of dismissed. You know, Ethel, you might not have anything to do, but other folks do. At the front door, Ruth looked at Susie Wells for explanation. The secretary merely shrugged. Ruth was also asked, but refused to pick up the liquor for the awards ceremony at a D.C. store, which would mean breaking the law. Virginia state law prohibited transporting more than a gallon of alcohol from Washington to Virginia. The penalty was a maximum 1-year jail sentence, a $500 fine, or confiscation of the car. I could just see myself being stopped with liquor for 200 people in my car going across Chain Bridge, said Ruth later. I said no. That was just out of the question. When it came to breaking the law, I was not about to do it. I ended up buying it at a Virginia liquor store where there was no discount. Ruth had made a wise decision. The Kennedy household had been under surveillance at the time by Virginia Liquor Board agents, who had even staked out a liquor store in Georgetown hoping to catch a Kennedy employee making a purchase. We've tried on several occasions to catch them, but unfortunately we've never had much luck, said Liquor Board enforcement agent Carl Hayden. To Ruth and scores of others who had dealings with Bobby Kennedy's widow during the 70s and 80s, including some of her children, Hickory Hill had, in many ways, become a disturbing and troublesome place because of Ethel's sometimes curious behavior and moods. Sometimes. I mean, if even one of these stories from this chapter and the next are true, I would never want to go back to this place. Ethel had a deep reserve of uncontrolled anger. Always annoyed, exasperated, and infuriated, she battered, emotionally and physically, those women who she had hired to help and serve her. Staff members and employees of the RFK Memorial and its subsidiaries, assaulted on a daily basis by Ethel's sudden onslaughts of denigrating comments and criticisms, were often reduced to tears. Some were moved to consult doctors and psychiatrists with real and imagined stomach problems, and at least one required life-saving hospitalization. Even apparently innocent activities could send Ethel into uncontrolled rages, especially if they had anything whatsoever to do with Bobby's memory or the Kennedy name. Visiting Hickory Hill on a rare occasion, Peter Lawford was nursing a cup of coffee in the kitchen, idly watching a newly hired maid go about her job. The woman had picked up various scraps of paper, including notes written by Bobby years earlier that Ethel had never bothered to file. She was headed toward the trash can when Ethel, standing by the door watching, saw that she was about to toss the paper. As Lawford later recounted the incident, Ethel screeched, "What are you doing?" The maid said, "I'm throwing this away, Mrs. Kennedy." And Ethel said, "You stupid N-word. Don't you know what you're doing? You're destroying history. Get out of my sight. You're fired." For throwing away some paper that had literally probably been on the counter for years at that point. Ethel had not cared enough to put away in a place that someone wouldn't throw it away. And then she's screaming at this poor new maid, calling her the N-word because she's cleaning up Ethel's house, which by all accounts was filthy. On his return to California, Lawford, disgusted by what he had witnessed, mentioned the incident to his new wife, Patricia Seton Lawford. Peter was very upset, she recalled years later. He had been very much into the civil rights movement, and he hated what Ethel had said. He felt for the woman who was dismissed by Ethel that very day. Over the years, he had seen a lot of self-righteous behavior in Ethel. He always called her Miss Skakel. He had a real problem with Ethel, and she barely tolerated him. To others, it seemed incomprehensible that Ethel, who counted Coretta King, Raffer Johnson, and Cesar Chavez among her friends, would shout a racial epithet, especially in light of Bobby's public stance and her devotion to his philosophies. Yeah, in public, but in public she said a lot of things. She said she was a mother, yet she had 11 children she had neglected, not outright, but by demeanor and by activity. She could have cared less about those kids. They were raised by nannies and whatever offhanded character she could hire off the road. So for somebody to be like, yeah, but she was Coretta King's friend, whatever, that doesn't mean anything. She also had 11 kids and wasn't a mom. But according to Noelle Fell, who'd never minced words, she claims that she never heard Ethel use the N-word. Noelle said, I never heard her use that word. But she would say things like, those black people are stupid. I really don't think she liked blacks or Hispanics. She couldn't stand it if they didn't speak English well or understand it. She would say something once, and she didn't like to repeat herself. Once leaving on a trip, Ethel had asked one of the maids, who had difficulty with English, to bring her a jar of face cream. When Mrs. Kennedy asked for something, said Noelle Fell, it had to be right away. Mrs. Kennedy was in a hurry, and when she was in a hurry, everything flew. Moments later, misunderstanding Ethel's request, the woman returned with sanitary napkins. That's not what I asked for! Screamed Ethel in a sudden fury. Shaken, the maid started to say she was sorry, but Ethel was already on her feet. I'll show you sorry, Ethel said. Then, according to Fell, who was in the room with the two women, Mrs. Kennedy hit her in the face, just slapped her. In shock, the maid ran out of Ethel's room, followed by Noelle Fell. She was crying and she ran to the basement and said she was going to leave. I said, Mrs. Kennedy's not in a good mood today. I'm so sorry. She should never have slapped you. This is not called for. Let me talk to her. She said, no, I'm never going to work here again. I don't want it. I don't need this. No one's ever slapped me. As the maid stormed out of the house, the secretary raced upstairs to deal with Ethel. She was still furious, Noelle said. When she got in bad moods like that, she didn't just jump out of them. Knowing that that was not the right time to bring up the slapping incident, Noelle helped Ethel finish packing. A while later, with Ethel calmer, Fell said to her boss, she's very upset that you slapped her. Do you think that you want her to continue working here, or do you really think that she's just that incompetent? Ethel, now petulant, refused to answer. She knew I'd seen it, and she knew she lost her cool. I said, she's a very good worker. She's the only one who comes and goes at the time that you want her. She's very valuable here, and I don't feel like we can lose her. Finally, Ethel said, I don't care what she does. So to Noelle, that meant that Ethel wanted the maid to stay. Otherwise, she would have said, fire her. The next day, Noelle met with the woman and apologized for Ethel. I didn't tell her that Mrs. Kennedy had said I don't care. I told her she really wants you back. Over the next week, the maid stayed out of Ethel's way. A few weeks after the slapping incident, while Ethel was throwing a party, the maid suffered a minor injury, and Ethel made a big to-do over her in front of all the other guests and announced that she personally would drive her to the emergency room at Fairfax Hospital. Mrs. Kennedy was a great actress, said Noelle Fell. She was trying to show her guests what a nice boss she was. I remember her saying, and I laughed to myself when I heard it, I have really valuable people working for me. She's one of the best. I'm going to take her to the hospital myself. But if she didn't have an audience, watch out. And in fact, in the next chapter, there is a shocking incident in which one of her friends actually sees her completely lose it on one of her secretaries. And Ethel is horribly embarrassed that somebody should catch her. But, finally. So don't worry, people knew. Besides her household help, many of whom feared and despised her, Ethel's tyrannical, mean-spirited manner also infuriated public servants, such as cab drivers and policemen, sometimes getting her into trouble. On her way to shop for gardening supplies in Barnstable near Hyannisport one September afternoon, Ethel pulled her convertible into a number 1 parking space, and a special officer, John Ebel, a young summer patrolman, ticketed her. Furious, she raced back to the car, grabbed the ticket, tore it methodically into dozens of pieces, and strode off. Shocked, Ebel reported what had happened to his superiors, who delivered a summons to Ethel at the compound, ordering her to appear in court on a charge of mutilating a parking ticket. In nearly 5 years, this is the first complaint of a mutilated parking ticket I can recall ever seeing, said Omar Chartrand, clerk of the 1st District Court in Barnstable. When she got home that day, Ethel was ranting and raving, recalled Noelle Fell. She said that she wasn't going to pay that ticket. She said she'd just jumped out of that car for a minute and it wasn't right that she should be ticketed. She claimed they picked on her specifically. She was really ticked off. Ethel, who had initially pleaded not guilty, didn't show up in court. But at the hearing, her Boston attorney admitted to sufficient facts of guilt. She was convicted and fined $31.25. When Rose Kennedy heard about the incident, she was beside herself, recalled Barbara Gibson. It seemed to her that there was always some kind of problem with Ethel, she said. Mrs. Kennedy had discussed with me writing a note to Ethel about the incident, but then decided against it, because she felt that it would only upset her and not accomplish anything. Because Ethel had been left with all those children, Rose felt sorry for her. She would often preface anything about Ethel by saying, "I don't know why Bobby had to go off and leave Ethel. It was so stupid." It was like she was blaming him, which, quite frankly, is what I think Ethel's problem was. I think that she blamed Bobby for leaving her, even though that's irrational. I think that, of course, there was probably a good deal of anger at God, but I don't know if, as a Catholic, she felt that she could stand there and be angry with God. So I think she just took it out on everybody else. But who she's really angry with is God, because she feels that God should not have ordained her life in this manner. Anyway, at Hickory Hill, Ethel routinely had members of the household staff telephone 3 or 4 different cab companies, when only one taxi was required to pick up a guest. The first cab that arrived got the fare, and the others were dismissed by the mistress of the house with an airy, "Well, you didn't come, so we had to call another." On one occasion, she refused to pay the fare, claiming it was too high, leading to a violent physical confrontation. Arriving at Hickory Hill from National Airport one evening, the cabbie pointed to the meter. "That'll be $12, Mrs. Kennedy." Looking in the rearview mirror, he saw fury stamped on her face. "$12?" she shrieked. "I don't care what your meter says. These things can be fixed. You're trying to take advantage of me. All you cab drivers are the same. No matter if I can afford it, I don't like being ripped off." Noel Fell, hearing the ruckus, ran outside. The driver, a Hispanic man who spoke only broken English, tried to explain. "I have to get paid. You don't have to give me a tip. I just want what's on the meter." But Ethel, hysterical, was beyond reason. "No, no, no," she screamed. "You ripped me off." With that said, she suddenly slapped him in the face, declared, "I'm not paying you," jumped out of the cab, slammed the door, and yelled to Noel Fell, "Bring my luggage in this minute." Mrs. Kennedy, who's got a pretty strong tennis swing, really hauled off and hit him with her open hand near his jaw, Fell said. The poor man was flabbergasted. She hurt him. His face was red. His mouth was open. He said, I have to have the money." I told him to wait a minute, and I went into the house, and I saw her, and I could tell she was scared. I went to my purse, I got the cash, and I paid him. And when I came back in, she asked me if I'd paid him, and when I said I did, she was furious, so pissed off that she looked like she wanted to kill me. "How dare you pay him?" she asked. "Well, it's not going to come out of my money." She refused to reimburse me. Fell said Ethel had frequent standoffs with other cab drivers, but that she decided not to get involved in the future. I figured she wouldn't show off so much if I stayed out of it, so I watched from the front door. She argued with them, said that they were taking advantage of her, said she wasn't going to pay until they decided to charge her what she really owed, and then they could have their bosses bill her. It seemed to me that she would always take on people who really couldn't afford to give her a break. She would fight with the people who were trying to make a modest living, the florist, the man who ran the wine and cheese shop, the cabbies. Ethel's behavior is appalling. What is the deal with her running around and just slapping people full in the face? I'm astounded. I am astounded that this is the way she wanted to behave. That this is who she wanted to be. And I truly think it all just comes down to the fact that she had nobody to help her figure out, and I don't think she had a will or a desire to figure out how to deal with this anger. But this is what comes of constantly saying that, fiddly-dee, I'll think about it tomorrow. Well, tomorrow's here. And your body's like, I have to deal with the pain that is inside me. And she just keeps refusing, and she just keeps refusing. Meanwhile, her children, her staff, everyone's being physically and verbally assaulted daily. All right, we're going to go back to Ruth. Poor Ruth. Remember, she is the one in charge of the RFK Journalism Awards, and she is not long for this Kennedy world. The book goes on to talk about her and says that the Sunday of the RFK Journalism Award luncheon, Ruth drove out to Hickory Hill early to make sure that everything was in order. As she calmly walked up to the house, she thought, well, I survived. We're here. It'll go off. But her brief reverie was rudely interrupted by Ethel yelling at the top of her lungs from the tennis court. "Ruth! Where are all the chairs?" What chairs? A mystified Ruth asked. The chairs for the people who are coming to the reception so they can sit, the exasperated Ethel explained slowly, as if talking to a child. Other than a few chairs set aside for elderly guests, Ruth told her that she had not been instructed to order extra chairs. Ethel muttered to herself and stormed off. Things still seemed to be going all right, Ruth recalled. But just as the party was about to begin, the head bartender, looking alarmed, approached her. "There aren't any white wine glasses," he said. Feeling her blood pressure soar, she told the bartender the glasses were on the list and the caterer was supposed to supply them. "There are," he intoned, "no white wine glasses. Get them." Like everyone else, the hired man knew of Ethel's temper and feared becoming a target, so he threw the responsibility into Ruth. Luckily, Ruth had asked her husband to accompany her to Hickory Hill that day to assist with any emergencies. In minutes, he was off in search of the glasses, but the only store he found open was a pharmacy that had a supply of tacky yellow plastic glasses with a little 19-cent price sticker attached. Perfect, Ruth thought. They'll go well with the deviled eggs and the peanut butter hors d'oeuvres on white bread with the crust removed. Ruth's husband was in the kitchen removing the price stickers from the glasses when one of Ethel's children marched by, looked at what he was doing, and warned gleefully, "Uh-oh, Mommy's not gonna like those." Under his breath, Darmstadter muttered, "Well, you know what Mommy can do with them." The rest of the day was a blur for Ruth. "When the ceremony was over, I just fled," she said later. "I got in the car and burst into tears and resolved to quit." In the office the next day, she announced her intention to Bunny Ronkovic, office manager for the RFK Memorial, who gave her some advice. "Mrs. Kennedy has forgotten it already," Ronkovic said. "It'll all blow over. Wait until Dave Hackett gets back and he'll handle it." Just then the telephone rang, and it was an angry Ethel demanding to know what she should do with all those horrible yellow wine glasses that she had sitting around. 2 days later, John Nolan, a Kennedy legal advisor, telephoned Ruth, saying he understood that things had not gone well, and wouldn't Ruth like to talk about it. A day or so later, Ruth met with Nolan and Hackett. "When I went in, I had a job, and when I came out, I didn't," she chuckled years later. "They told me, 'We just think you're not happy here.'" I hate that line. "Oh, you think, do you? Well, why don't you ask me, and I'll let you know if you should let me go or not." I just, of all the lines that one can give when one is letting someone go, don't ever, if you are ever in a position to let someone go, do not use the line, "Well, we think that you're not happy here, so we're going to let you go." Oh, don't do me the favor. If you're so certain of it, then why don't we have a conversation? I don't know. Not that anyone's ever had the opportunity to use that line on me, but I just feel like if anyone did, I would find it so, so demeaning. "Oh, you assume I'm not happy? Okay, well, let's talk about it, and that way you don't have to let me go, because I can let you know how it really is." Anyway, they tell her they thought she just wasn't happy. And she says, "I could see their handwriting on the wall. It was obvious I was being fired, and it was obvious that Ethel had done it." Ruth complained to the New York Times' Jack Rosenthal, the incoming chairman of the Journalist Committee. He said, "Don't worry about it, just leave it in our hands." But when push comes to shove, whose side are they going to take? The journalists wanted to be on the committee because it gave them access to the Kennedys in a way that they never would have had. I was certainly dispensable. Ruth demanded, and got, a letter of recommendation from the committee signed by Paul Duke of PBS, Ed Guthman, Bobby's old press secretary at Justice, who was now in the Philadelphia Inquirer, Dorothy Gilman of the Washington Post, Betty Cole Dukert of NBC, and Jack Rosenthal. In the end, it was Ruth's choice of wine glasses that really rankled Ethel and did her in. God forbid we have some plastic glasses. Let's just make someone lose their job. Somebody who's faithfully worked for you these many years, but, it's all her fault that everything was closed and her husband could only find some plastic glasses at a pharmacy. How in the world would you just fire somebody over such a small thing? But I don't think Ethel needed a better reason. I think she was small enough and petty enough to fire you over some plastic glasses at a party. All right, on to chapter 102, entitled Stomach Pains. We're going to continue the theme. Most of the people who came to work for Ethel were initially charmed by her and mesmerized by the Kennedy mystique. Deep down, they hoped to move from being Kennedy employees to Kennedy friends, part of the clan's circle and legend. They certainly didn't come aboard because of the pay, benefits, or perks. The Kennedys were notoriously stingy with their help, and Ethel, always under the gun to cut back on her spending, was far from an exception. Once Ethel's employees realized what they had gotten themselves into, many were still willing to sacrifice their self-respect and their health just to have a little taste of what remained of Camelot. which at a certain point you just have to say that's your fault. If you want to be used and abused and left in this horribly crippled and toxic employer-employee relationship, that's kind of on you. And I know that Ethel was out of control. But you got to have enough self-respect to say, I'm done here. You can't treat me like this. I actually don't want this. And you have to ask yourself, why does it matter to you so much to be in this circle of the Kennedy mystique? These are only other human beings who happen to have a little more in their bank account than you. They are another human being. They are flesh and blood. They use the toilet. They are normal people. There's nothing about these people that makes them a higher breed of humanity. Ethel Kennedy fell ass backwards into all the money she had. She grew up in a family where her dad had worked his ass off and had handed her a whole bunch of money. She has money not because of anything she did, but because of who she happened to be born to. To give so much credence to another human being because of the circumstances which they found themselves is so small-minded. Don't do this. Do not do this. Do not idolize people. People will let you down. Time and time again, they will let you down. And all these people who wanted to work for the Kennedys, because they're Kennedys. I don't want to say they deserved what they got, because nobody deserves to be slapped, kicked around, degraded, and verbally abused. But it is your fault if you stay in a place that is not good for you and in which you are being degraded. Why do you want to stay there? Unless it was something like you thought it was funny and it was like for stories and there was some sort of benefit that you were gaining from being treated that way. I guess you can stay. I still think that it's kind of broken to idolize someone to the extent that you're willing to be abused. Just so you don't, I don't know what, you don't have to face the music that your, idol isn't all that you thought they were going to be. I don't know why anyone would stay for this, but continuing. When Ruth Dromsdotter first heard that a job was open working for Ethel, she was thrilled, despite a warning from her predecessor, Margot Higdon, to, quote, stay out of Ethel's way. The idea of working with the Kennedys was excited, a true Washington glamour job, she felt. Like Ruth, Noelle Fell had also jumped at the chance to work for Ethel, whom she initially thought of as, quote, magnetic, strong, lovable, friendly, real, well-appointed. I was in awe of her. Fell said her optimism about working at Hickory Hill had not been clouded when she saw Ethel's treatment of Sandra Renzi, the woman Fell succeeded. I saw Sandra in tears so many times, Fell said. If Ethel was in a bad mood, no matter what Sandra did, it just wasn't good enough. If the wrong tea bag was put in Ethel's cup by the chef, it was Sandra's fault. Sandra would take the chef's recommendations of the day and bring it up to Mrs. Kennedy in the morning. If she was in a bad mood, she'd take the menu, cross things off, write things on it, get pissed, get ticked off. Yet, somehow, that didn't bother Noelle. Noelle witnessed the whole thing with Sandra, and yet she was down for it? She wanted some of the abuse? Coates Redmond, who was Ruth's successor as executive director of the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Awards program, felt the same awe as the other women. But she, too, received a warning. This one from Bunny Ronkovic. When you go out to Hickory Hill, if you don't like her and she doesn't like you, you're going to know it. If that happens, for God's sake, do not take the job. Working for Ethel can be totally and utterly lethal. This is the way it is, and we choose to work here. But Coates, also a widow, considered Ethel an icon and Hickory Hill a shrine. She came away truly impressed from her first meeting with the lady of the house. I had a tremendous amount of empathy for her, she said later. She was just as advertised, preppy and cute and very friendly. I was thinking, I like this woman, and I could work for this woman, and I can see that she can be difficult because she's got a very high level of energy. She runs a big establishment. She's the nation's widow. She's famous. She has famous friends. I wanted to be her friend, to get along with her, and I was very predisposed to do so. I had a wonderful attitude about all the Kennedys. I saw them as attractive, smart, and stylish. Basically, she just worshipped the ground they walked on. And I suppose if you do that, maybe you are able to overlook their many faults, but a more clear-eyed person might see them for what they are more immediately. At first, Coates thought that it was fun to be part of the Kennedy satellite system. It was hypnotic. But before long, she discovered that the only real pleasure to be found on the job was gallows humor. We'd sit around describing ways to kill Ethel. We put together a joke list of tongue-in-cheek things to do to make Ethel love you, such as calling her husband Bobby instead of Senator Kennedy. Like Ruth, Coates Redmond's job entailed producing the annual awards ceremony, dubbed Throw Up Day by the anxiety-ridden staff. But this is the story where Ethel's really going to get hers. And if you found yourself just boiling over with indignation at the way she treated people, it all comes out in the end. You cannot act like this forever and eternity, and no one will ever find out who you really are. And this next story is rich. During one of the event luncheons, Ethel was sipping the mussel soup when she noticed that John Siegenthaler, one of the guests at the head table, had suddenly vanished. John, a former Justice Department aide to Bobby, had quietly left the table to go in search of Coates, whom he liked, and expected would join him and Ethel for lunch. He was unaware that only moments earlier Ethel had told Coates that she wasn't welcome at the table, that her job was to organize, not socialize. Coates and her assistant, Caroline Bishop, had then retreated into the study, where Ethel's secretary of the moment, another beleaguered employee, was sitting at her desk. The three women were commiserating when Siegenthaler entered. "What the hell are you doing in here?" he asked. "Why aren't you at the table?" "Well, we've been disinvited," said Coates. "We're not allowed to sit down with you swells." "Oh, you're kidding." "That's the way it is," said Bishop. "Well, what do you expect?" said the secretary. Redmond, Bishop, and Siegenthaler were now seated on the sofa off to the side of the room, out of the view of the entrance, when Ethel stormed in, leaned over the secretary's desk, grabbed her by the lapels of her blazer, lifted her out of her chair, and started shaking her violently, screaming, "Where's the food? Where's the food? The food isn't coming fast enough. Second course! Second course!" Trembling, she whispered, "I don't know, Mrs. Kennedy. That's not my job." "Well, find out. Find out. Go to the kitchen and find out!" Ethel screamed, continuing to shake her. "Mrs. Kennedy, I'm not supposed to have anything to do with it," the secretary gulped. "I'm telling you, go to the kitchen and find out this minute." Finally, Ethel released the secretary, who fell back into her chair, ashen-faced. As she turned to leave, Ethel came face to face with John Siegenthaler, who was all but speechless at the scene he had just witnessed. He had heard stories about Ethel's behavior in the past, but had never put credence in them. Coates and her assistant, both of whom had been the brunt of such abuse in the past, sat quietly, watching the scene. Oh, stuttered Ethel. Where were you, John?" Ethel asked, trying to appear composed. "Suddenly you were gone from the table." "Well, I'm right here, Ethel," he responded calmly. Unnerved, Ethel started to back up toward the doorway, telling Siegenthaler to return to the dining room because the food's getting cold. Then she suddenly turned and walked into a wall. For everyone, the scene was highly embarrassing, and Ethel, visibly shaken, left the room alone and red-faced. "All right, now I see," said Siegenthaler somberly to the other women before making his way back to the dining room. At another event, Ethel became enraged when she noticed that Caroline Bishop's adhesive name tag wasn't properly positioned on her body. Ethel wanted all name tags located directly over the collarbone. Okay, this is my collarbone right here. I have never, in all my born days, put my name tag here. Who could see it? I'm not saying we need to have it right here on our breast, but could we have it here? Like here? Well, who puts it over the collarbone? Am I reading that correctly? Yep, directly over the collarbone. When she saw that Bishop's was an inch too low, she ripped it off her blouse and slammed it in the proper place, using the full force of her palm. "It's supposed to be there," she ordered as Bishop fell backward in pain. "Don't you know how you're supposed to wear it?" Ethel screeched before stomping off. "She very nearly broke Caroline's collarbone," said Coach Redmond, who was present. "She can be violent." One of the most embarrassing situations witnessed by staffers of the memorial involved Dave Hackett. Lore had it that Bobby and Hackett, who had met at Milton Academy, where they had become the closest of friends, were the two boys portrayed in writer John Knoll's novel A Separate Piece. After Milton, Hackett had gone on to college in Canada with hopes of having a career of his own, but Bobby had convinced him to work for the Kennedy family in various political jobs. After Bobby's death, the family gave Hackett the job of running the RFK Memorial. But by the 80s, insiders said the Kennedys had decided to run the programs directly themselves, and they had no need for Hackett. There was anger on both sides, including a memorable screaming match in the street outside the memorial's offices between Hackett and a Kennedy family operative. On another occasion, the irate Hackett tossed all of the Journalism Award program files into the trash. Coach Redmond, called from home by Bunny Ronkovic, had to race into town and rescue the files before they were picked up by the trashmen. Coates, who was working under Hackett at the time, said they just got rid of him. Dave never knew what hit him. It was sad. Ethel's attitude, her constant mood changes, her sudden demands all had a deleterious effect on the people who worked for her. Those on staff in McLean had begun calling the place Hickory Hell. Those working for the RFK Memorial now referred to it as the Hell Hole. Noelle Fell, for one, suffered a sudden heart attack at age 35. We'd just come back after a summer at Hyannisport, she recalled. I'd been working very hard. It had been so hectic. The hours had become so unreasonable because there had been a lot of parties. I was there 18 hours a day. There was never any relief. Suddenly I felt real bad and I just couldn't go to work. I called in and I said I was sick and I didn't know what was wrong. I could hardly move. That night I had a heart attack and was rushed to Fairfax Hospital. Though I received a bouquet of flowers from Mrs. Kennedy, she never called me. When I got home, she never contacted me. I had never worked with somebody who was so non-caring. Mrs. Kennedy asked one of the maids to call me. When I told her to tell Mrs. Kennedy that I needed some weeks to recover, she was very upset, and she said that she would just replace me. Val made a quick recovery, and Ethel took her back. One of your staff has a heart attack, and you're like, don't bother coming back, we'll just replace you. I mean, no wonder Ethel had a hard time retaining staff if this is the way she treated people. I mean, did she think that she has employed a league of robots who can just keep going and going and going? This is not the Energizer Bunny. One of Ethel's favorite helpers was Susie Wells, who was hardworking, loyal, athletic, and cute. To show her appreciation, Ethel once gave Wells a puppy. She even made an appearance at her wedding. But even Wells, who had great affection for Ethel, suffered, according to other Kennedy employees. Coach Redmond said that Wells had experienced stomach problems for working on Ethel's annual fundraising celebrity tennis tournament. Ethel sent her to her doctor. Bunny Ronkovic, described variously as a Kennedy priestess and a Kennedy nun, also complained of stomach disorders that she suspected were related to her work, colleagues said. Coates, too, began experiencing stomach problems that she attributed directly to Ethel's constant raving and criticisms. I had almost 5 years of it, and it had a profound effect on me, she said later. Coates said she had become so anxious that I made an appointment to see Dr. Evelyn Neff, a respected Georgetown psychiatrist. At their one and only session, Coates described her symptoms. Dr. Neff asked me what kind of a stress I had, and I said high stress. I told Dr. Neff that I had these pains in my left side, and I said I suspected that they were psychosomatic. I said I wanted to discuss it because I didn't know what to do about it. She asked me to tell her about my professional life, and I said, well, for 3 months of the year, I have to deal in a very intense way with Ethel Kennedy. Dr. Neff said, say no more. As a seasoned observer of life at Hickory Hill noted, Ethel's life was wonderful on the ascendancy with Bobby. But before they ever reached the tippity top, it was finished, and she became very angry at that. She had wanted her life to stay the way it had always been. She felt like fate had been so good to her, and that she was entitled to have fate continue to be good to her. And then fate turned on her. Ethel's anger, Ethel's rage, was enormous. Enormous. I don't know about you guys, but I find these chapters to be some of the most shocking. And I think that the brutal treatment of her staff, the complete and total disrespect that she had for other human beings, the disregard she had for those that she thought were beneath her, I think all that civil rights talk was all something she did because that's what Bobby was interested in. Bobby's gone. And I don't think Bobby would have been into the way that she talked to people or treated people. I don't think anybody could be. Can you imagine being married or connected to somebody or linked to somebody in any way who would treat other people that way with such utter disdain and disrespect? The embarrassment that you would feel constantly being associated with that person. I mean, I'm with Rose Kennedy. Can you imagine just being like, oh gosh, you know, who got the merry widow over there calling folks the N-word? I just would feel like can I please wash my hands of this girl that used to be in my husband's life? You know, now she's got all those grandkids. And everyone's always giving her this pass, being, oh, she's got all those kids to deal with. That was her choice. You know, she didn't have to have 11 children that she did not really want, but that were just there to substantiate the claim that she was a mother. It takes a lot more than just getting pregnant to be a mom. The next chapter is more of the same. Except more specifically, she's trying to get rid of the beloved nanny that had raised the kids. And she was a black woman from the Dominican Republic, I think it is. And she just hated her. She hated her. She was so jealous of her. Now, Bobby had loved this woman. And Ethel, as soon as Bobby's gone, is on a campaign to get rid of her, but the kids love her, and the kids don't want their mom to get rid of her, to fire her. And she's also elderly now. And so it's this whole like butting of heads. And it's an intense chapter. It's definitely one to look forward to, which we'll get to later this week. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate you. Appreciate all of you for watching. I appreciate all of you for commenting and just helping this channel to continue to flourish. I'll talk to you guys soon. Bye.